Tonight,
what must we say to our people?
The epic finale of a 6-part CNC3 special series.
We are nowhere near where we need to be yet.
The Prime Minister returned to Glasgow this morning and has urged nations to pull out all the stops.
As world leaders race to strike a climate deal.
What does the future hold for the Caribbean? Will tourism erode with its coastlines? And will the major polluters pay to those they damage? A CNC3 special series concludes tonight. The Washington Post labeled it on Friday morning, small words with big implications and a lot of waiting. That's been the essence of these past 2 weeks in Glasgow. And even if negotiators reached a deal and got all 200 signatories, the words they signed on to would still mean very little without action. The implications are far-reaching, not least for us here in the Caribbean, or as Prime Minister Mia Mottley likes to say, those of us living on the front lines of this climate change crisis. And while world leaders and negotiators have been locked in talks over the last 2 weeks, I stumbled across this clip this morning, which was a reminder that as we speak, there are people already suffering from droughts and already suffering from rising sea levels.
I have seen with my own eyes 3 young children crying at the side of a dried-up river after walking 12 miles with their mother to find water. Please open your hearts.
That was Elizabeth Wathuti, a youth climate activist from Kenya. So why did I play that clip? You see, what's happening in parts of Africa right now, Asia, the Pacific, is eventually going to come right home to our doorstep here in the Caribbean. It really is a very real image and a very realistic image, given our changes in weather patterns already. Coming up after the break, is the Caribbean ready for an onslaught that is to come? Should we now begin changing our approach to living? Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, who is the CARICOM chairman, Prime Minister Gaston Browne, will be joining me next.
The difference between small island developing states and industrialized nations is the capacity to respond. It takes a single storm, a few hours, to destroy the economy and infrastructure of an entire small island state, which lacks the necessary financial and other resources to rebound and rebuild.
Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and CARICOM Chairman Gaston Browne addressing the COP26 conference in Glasgow last week. You know, I remember the first show when I spoke to the United Nations Global Ambassador for Climate Change, Raquel Moses, and I asked her if she felt CARICOM was acting cohesively and decisively when it comes to climate change. Her response was her only regret is that CARICOM doesn't publicize the work they do. She feels there is a lot of good work being done in the region, but not enough people know about it. But in this decisive decade, CARICOM leadership of those living on the front lines of this climate crisis will prove to be even more pivotal. I am honored to have the company of Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and CARICOM Chairman Gaston Browne as a guest. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Certainly a viewership, certainly a pleasure, and thank you. And you know, it's an opportunity here to share some insights with the people of Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you for having me. And the people of Trinidad and Tobago and our viewers are certainly ecstatic to have you in our company and address us tonight. Mr. Prime Minister, let me just start by saying congratulations. Your country, Antigua and Barbuda, marks 40 years of being independent this month. Congratulations from us to you. Thank you. Appreciate it. We're now growing into maturity. Joining you, you know, among the pantheon of matured countries within the CARICOM space.
Mr. Prime Minister, I want to start where everybody started at the COP26 conference, at least from SDIS like ours. Small island and developing states made the case at COP26 about funding. It's the most important aspect of climate change for us here in the Caribbean, getting necessary funding, whether it's from the Climate Green Fund or any other sort of funding. You yourself, as CARICOM chairman, made a very bold case in front of the world last week. Do you think we're anywhere closer to accessing funds to fight off, the effects of climate change in the Caribbean after COP26?
Well, we made incremental gains at COP in Glasgow during the last week and a half. Unfortunately, the ambitions are not as extensive as they ought to be, including the funding ambitions. As you know, there was a floor limit of $100 billion to be made available yearly, and the commitments that have been made so far would have fallen short of that $100 million and a billion. In the first instance, the $100 billion is inadequate. And the fact that we have not achieved that ambition, it tells us that, we will have significant challenges going forward. And those challenges obviously could increase based on the fact that there has been an overshoot of the 1.5 degree goal. We all know that this is the last decade for countries to increase their ambitions, to reduce emissions, to scale up funding, to reduce subsidies to carbon fuel industries, and at the same time to have stronger global collaboration so that we can avoid the worst consequences of climate change. But unfortunately, even though incremental gains have been made, we have not seen the level of ambition that will literally help us to avoid, overshooting that 1.5 degree goal. And that is critical to our survival, for small island states who are on the front lines of climate change. That 1.5 is an issue of life and death for us. I mean, whereas other, developed countries and advanced developing countries, they're far more resilient and that they could recover from the effects of climate change. The reality is we continue to suffer disproportionately, and our own advancement and our civilization, they have been put at risk. And that is why we have to constantly agitate and push to have these countries scale up their commitments so that we can achieve that goal of 1.5. I mean, that is the ultimate goal that we're trying to achieve.
Mr. Prime Minister, the common denominator at that conference from small island developing states across our region was funding, yes. But do you feel that the Caribbean, CARICOM I should rather say, is speaking as a united voice, or is Port of Spain saying something, St. John's is saying something, Kingston is saying something, Bridgetown is saying something else? Or are you satisfied that the Caribbean has one common position on how we move forward with climate change?
I would say for COP26, we achieved a harmonized messaging. In fact, all of the delegations, all of the heads spoke about these common themes about achieving 1.5 for large emitters to cut their emissions, to remove fossil fuel subsidies, and at the same time to accelerate the transition into green energy applications, as well as providing adequate funding to facilitate the transition into green energy so that countries can achieve their NDCs. And most CARICOM countries would have set a target of becoming carbon neutral by about 2040. I have to say too that even prior to attending the conference in Glasgow, we held a meeting of heads in which those issues were discussed. So it's not a coincidence that we all moved in lockstep and that we had a common message at COP26 in Glasgow. So we did achieve a level of harmonization in the messaging, and that is certainly one of the achievements compared to previous COPs when we would have gone our disparate ways.
One of the common effects that climate change will have on the Caribbean is the Caribbean's tourism industry. We sell sun, sea, and sand, especially our beaches. If that industry becomes eroding, and I'm speaking about beaches, and your country, Antigua and Barbuda, has 365 beaches, right? One for each day of the year. What effect do you think, our tourism industry is going to have this decade going into the next decade? And are we sufficiently prepared to deal with the effects of rising sea levels that could, erode our coastlines, erode our beaches?
Well, we're not sufficiently prepared. And one of the reasons too is that we do not have the financial resources to adapt to the effects of climate change. And when you look at all of the consequences of climate change, which we're suffering, even melting glaciers in the temperate countries, those are affecting us because they contribute to sea level rise. And in many Caribbean countries, countries in the Pacific as well as Indian Oceans, we would have seen sea level rise. One of our most beautiful beaches on Antigua and Dickinson Bay, part of the beach is now covered in water because of sea level rise. We also are suffering the consequences of the pollution of our marine waters. So there's marine pollution, there's ocean acidification in which our coral reefs are actually dying. We have consistent droughts, and when it does rain, we end up with floods. So we're literally suffering all of the consequences of climate change, including heat waves. And, our beaches, if we're going to lose our beaches, then we'll lose our tourism product because that is one of the major attractions for tourists. So climate change, is impacting us in a serious way. And that is why we have to bring it to the forefront of our discussions and to, at the same time, educate our respective populations about the consequences of climate change, because this issue is the most significant existential threat facing our people and human civilization as a whole. So it requires an all of society approach in order to effectively address this issue. And that is why we have to also increase the level of public awareness, public education on this issue so that people have a better understanding and that they themselves too could become involved in the mitigating efforts in order to reduce the effects of climate change. But again, when you look at the lack of adequate commitments, we may well have to focus on adaptation to try and adapt to these effects. But again, adaptation methods will take a significant amount of financing. And that is where too we have to continue to push these large polluters to scale up their funding. And as you know, Antigua and Barbuda is leading an initiative on the issue of loss and damage, in which we have literally formed a new commission, a SIDS commission on climate change and international law, in which we're now seeking to introduce a legal pathway to complement the voluntary efforts of these large polluting countries so that they'll become legally responsible for their emissions. We do not believe that we can rely exclusively on their random acts of charity whenever our countries suffer the adverse effects of climate change. They must be made to pay. And we're operating on the principle that the polluter pays. I mean, there's a well-known legal principle, a tort, in which the person who injures the other is required to provide some form of restitution. So we believe that the issue of climate change and climate justice is not only an issue of morality, but an issue of law in which they should be made legally to pay. Because again, if we're going to rely exclusively on these voluntary efforts, we're pretty sure that we would not achieve the objective of 1.5. And if we don't achieve that goal, then our own civilization will be imperiled.
Mr. Prime Minister, you made two very important points there. The polluter pays, because what we've seen over the course of this pandemic is when global crises hit, that funding or that proposed funding is going to dip significantly. And two as well, you mentioned about tourism, you expanded on tourism. Is it now time that CARICOM, not just Trinidad and Tobago, not Barbados, not Antigua, not Jamaica, but CARICOM comes up with a plan B, internal tourism, inland tourism. We look to other forms of tourism other than sun, sea, and sand. Are we going to be forced to do that, I'm asking?
Well, absolutely. There is now a need for us to diversify our tourism product and also to make the existing product, more resilient. Most of our properties are on the beach, but we may have to look at, taking some of these tourism properties in the future inland. so that we don't find ourselves in a situation in which all our beach properties are, eventually made inviable, and we cannot sustain a tourism product. And not only that, the way they build and even the physical environment in which they have the properties must be enhanced. I believe we have to plant more trees around those properties in order to sequester more carbon, to also create shade, recognizing that we consistently have these heat waves, and to make these properties green, to make them more climate resilient. So we have to definitely look at the product, look at the physical plant, and to make the physical plant more climate resilient. And generally speaking, it's not just for a tourism product, but right throughout, in all of society approach in which our homes and our buildings, our infrastructure, we have to, build in a more resilient way, a more climate resilient way. Cables and so on that ordinarily will be above ground, electricity lines and so on will now have to be put on the ground to make them more climate resilient, especially considering that we're likely to see even more frequent and more powerful storms. I mean, we'd have witnessed what happened in 2017, in which, a couple of hurricanes, Hurricane Irma and Maria, literally ripped through the Caribbean region. I want to make sure that where we have those extreme climate events, that the damage will be minimal, but at the same time, to push the international community to provide compensation, because it is extremely unjust that these poor Caribbean countries, they have to suffer the consequences of the large polluting nations. And as a consequence, we have to be borrowing repeatedly to repair damaged economy, damaged infrastructure, and damaged buildings. That is definitely, a form of injustice that has to be addressed. And that is why I believe too that the legal initiative that has been undertaken by Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu, that other Caribbean countries and small island states in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, they ought to join. I have to tell you, I'm a little disappointed that none of my colleagues within the CARICOM region would have volunteered so far to join, but I remain hopeful that they will, because if we do not have this type of harmonized approach in defending our own interests and to utilize all the tools available to us, including the legal tools, in order to agitate for change, then obviously will be overlooked, and countries will, the large polluters, they will ignore interests, and they will continue to prejudice our development and, leave us on the margins of global development. We cannot afford to be leaders who are inactive and who may be afraid of our own shadow, afraid of maybe possible repercussions. When it comes to the issue of justice, we must stand firm in the interests of the Caribbean people.
Mr. Prime Minister, what do you say, also speaking in your capacity as CARICOM chair, to countries like Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, that is, heavily dependent on the oil and gas sector, the energy sector? I know that you're going to respond by saying they're less than 1% of global emissions and not large polluters in the larger scale of China, India, and the United States. But what do you say to the Caribbean region that also contributes?
Well, maximize their profits now that there's a window that they can continue to burn their fossil fuel energy, and use those proceeds to diversify the economies as soon as possible, because ultimately, I mean, all of us want to see, these fossil fuels stay in the ground. We know that they will be around for at least a couple more decades, maybe 3 decades, and that's sufficient time for them to develop sufficient surpluses that they can diversify into other sectors, including tourism. But ultimately, the burning of fossil fuels, is not in the interest of human civilization. Fossil fuel is supposed to stay in the ground.
Mr. Prime Minister, the coastal erosion on our coastlines here in the Caribbean is happening right now, and it's becoming more rapidly down the years. The cost of coastal erosion is something that a lot of people are not thinking about. They talk a lot about the coastal erosion that's happening, but there's a huge cost associated with it, particularly that those people living on our coastlines in the Caribbean now have to move inland. Can you expand on, what we can do to get funding to help stave off the effects of coastal erosion?
Well, that's one of the consequences of climate change. And the irony about it is not only coastal communities in the Caribbean or in small island states globally that are affected. I mean, even the great United States, every year they get hit by a hurricane. at least one hurricane. The coastal communities are literally at risk. But I imagine that because they have the resources in order to recover quickly, that they have not in the past paid the type of attention that they ought to. Admittedly, we have seen great efforts now by President Biden, in which the United States is providing leadership to address this existential threat of climate change that is literally facing humanity. And we expect them, as part of their leadership and one of the major polluters, to provide funding to help small island states here in the Caribbean, especially considering that we are the third border, to help us to adapt and mitigate against the effects of climate change, and to utilize the technologies that they will develop in the coming years to address issues such as coastal erosion, which is affecting all of our states. So this requires external collaboration. I mean, it is evident that we just don't have the resources, but ultimately, in order to mitigate against coastal erosion and other effects of climate change, we have to reduce global emissions. And that is why it's so important for the Caribbean region to provide leadership on this issue and to be at the forefront of the agitation and pressing these large polluters to reduce emissions, and at the same time to provide mitigation and adaptation funding. I mean, the reality is the funds required, or the funding required for adaptation and mitigation, they are literally beyond our means. And it is unfair for, small island states who are suffering the consequences of the polluting actions of these developed and advanced developing countries to be called upon to foot the bill. Not only that we don't have the resources, but we're not the ones who created the problem in the first instance. And as I said before, the polluter should pay, and they should be made to pay legally. And I think that pursuing this action under the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea is one of the pathways that we could pursue successfully. And again, I'm looking forward to other Caribbean countries joining this initiative as we keep the pressure on these large polluters. And I should make the point here too that we're not seeking to hold them responsible for past actions. We're saying going forward, wherever there's damage, they ought to pay, because the burning of fossil fuels in these advanced developing countries and developed countries, it is deliberate. And it's the burning of fossil fuels. I mean, yes, they're providing energy supply of various countries, but the major issue here, the major motive is the profit motive. So they're making trillions of dollars in profits, and here we're suffering the consequences. They must be made to pay. They need to share some of those profits to help us to adapt and to mitigate against the effects of climate change. But most importantly, we have to push them to reduce their emissions, because if we're to avoid the worst consequences of climate change, then the only way to achieve that, no amount of money will be able to mitigate against the future consequences. The only thing that can really mitigate is a reduction in the amount of carbon that these countries are putting in Earth's atmosphere.
Prime Minister Gaston Browne, thank you so much for taking the time out and taking up our offer of coming on to COP26 now or never to deal with some very serious issues as we enter a very serious decade in the Caribbean. We really appreciate it.
Certainly a pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Prime Minister Gaston Browne, and also the CARICOM chairman, joining us on COP26 now or never. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll have our final word on the show. You know, 2 weeks ago, we made an editorial decision to provide you with extensive coverage of the COP26 climate change conference. It meant cutting into our newscast at 7:30 for 3 days a week. It was the most important meeting in the history of our planet, and not only did we want you to understand why this meeting was so important, but to also understand how life is radically changing before your eyes, and the changes that are to come and the adjustments that will be required in the future. From your response, we can conclude we were somewhat successful in gathering national attention to a global crisis, one that impacts all of us. Thank you for your calls, your messages, your emails that only encouraged us more to treat with this topic in a serious and urgent manner. Thank you to all our guests who gave us their time and knowledge to make us a little bit smarter about such a complex topic. We owe you a debt of gratitude. And while it may seem our hands are too small to effect any real change when it comes to the climate crisis, there are small things we can do for our planet. We can drive less, bike more, reduce, reuse, recycle, conserve water, learn more about this topic. We are headed to a point where half the world will bake and the other half will drown. And you don't know which half is coming to you. Thank you, and have a good night. It's the most important meeting in the history of our planet.
Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
How many more voices and how many more pictures of people must we see on these screens without being able to move? Or are we so blinded and hardened that we can no longer appreciate the cries of humanity?
It is the decisive decade to reverse the course of climate change, and it is the start of a decisive week in Glasgow.
And the question we must now ask ourselves is, what is it that we are fighting for? Are we fighting to save ourselves and the living planet? Or are we fighting to maintain business as usual?
In my lifetime, I've witnessed a terrible decline. In yours, you could and should witness a wonderful recovery. That desperate hope, ladies and gentlemen, delegates, excellency, is why the world is looking to you and why you are here.